From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
George Zimmerman got away with murder, but you can't get away from God. And at the end of the day, he's going to have a lot of questions and answers he has to deal with. The law couldn't prove it, but, you know, the world goes in circles.
Got away with murder? That's the juror who ultimately voted to acquit George Zimmerman for killing Trayvon Martin. But she started deliberations believing he was guilty of second-degree murder. She's the one woman of color on the 6-woman jury. We'll get response to the ABC exclusive interview. We'll also go to Florida, where protesters are marching from Jacksonville to Sanford. We'll speak with one of them who visited Marissa Alexander. She's the African-American woman tried by the same prosecutor in the Zimmerman case, who is serving a 20-year sentence for firing warning shots into a wall against her abusive husband. He was not injured. But first to Egypt, where the armies called for mass protests against the Muslim Brotherhood. Authorities have also detained ousted President Mohamed Morsi.
The coalition asserts that the threats made by Sisi, leader of the military coup, is nothing short of a full call on civil war.
We'll go to Cairo for the latest from Democracy Now!'s Sharif Abdel-Quddus. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Egyptian state media is reporting authorities have detained ousted President Mohamed Morsi on new charges. This is the first update on Morsi's status since he was forced from office July 3rd. Morsi will reportedly be detained for 15 days pending investigations into his suspected collaboration with the Palestinian group Hamas for a prison break during the 2011 uprising against the Mubarak regime. The news comes as Egypt is seeing major protests today in support of Army General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. The Army's top leader asked supporters this week to demonstrate in support of a military crackdown on what he called violence and potential terrorism. We'll have more from Egypt with Democracy Now!'s Sharif Abdel-Quddus after headlines. The United Nations has increased its count of the death toll in Syria's more than 2-year-old civil war to cover over 100,000. The figure's up from 93,000 deaths announced last month. Speaking before a meeting with Syrian opposition members at the UN, Secretary of State John Kerry said the U.S. remains committed to convening international peace talks in Geneva on ending Syria's conflict.
There is no military solution to Syria. There is only a political solution, and that will require leadership in order to bring people to the table. Yesterday, I had a conversation with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov of Russia. We remain committed to the effort to bring the parties to a Geneva II, to implement Geneva I. And we will try our hardest to make that happen as soon as is possible.
Iran's reportedly floated an offer of direct nuclear talks with the United States. The New York Times reports Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki relayed the proposal earlier this month and offered to facilitate any future discussions. The Justice Department's unveiled plans to restore some of the oversight struck down in last month's Supreme Court decision that gutted the Voting Rights Act. Speaking to the National Urban League's annual conference in Philadelphia, Attorney General Eric Holder said he'll ask a federal court to require that Texas obtain federal approval for all changes to its voting laws.
This request to bail in the state of Texas and to require it to obtain pre-approval from either the department or a federal court before implementing future voting changes is available under the Voting Rights Act when intentional voting discrimination is found. Based on the evidence of intentional racial discrimination that was presented just last year in the redistricting case of Texas v. Holder, as well as the history of pervasive voting-related discrimination against racial minorities that the Supreme Court itself has recognized, we believe that the state of Texas should be required to go through a pre-clearance process whenever it changes its voting laws and practices.
A federal court last year ruled the Republican-controlled state house in Texas discriminated against people of color in its redrawing of political maps for congressional and legislative districts ahead of the 2012 election. Holder's announcement marks the Obama administration's first policy move since the Supreme Court invalidated a critical portion of the landmark 1965 Voting Rights Act that required 9 states with a history of racial discrimination to obtain federal approval for changes to voting rules. Holder says more actions will be announced in the coming weeks, including challenges to voter ID laws nationwide. The lone woman of color on the all-female jury that acquitted George Zimmerman has come forward to reveal she believed he was guilty. Speaking to ABC News, the woman, identified by her first name of Maddie, said she initially wanted to convict Zimmerman, but changed her mind after deciding there wasn't enough evidence in the eyes of the law. The juror said she suffers from the outcome of the trial and shares the grief of Trayvon Martin's mother.
It's hard for me to sleep. It's hard for me to eat. Yes.
You haven't asked for money. You haven't asked for a book deal. You haven't asked for anything other than a forum to be able to tell your story.
Yeah. I don't need money. No money in this world could pay me to forget the pain that I'm going through. Trayvon Martin will always be in my heart.
But she wanted to talk about the verdict, how the jury reached it, and about what she sees as perhaps a higher justice.
At the end of the day, he's going to have a lot of questions and answers he has to deal with. The law couldn't prove it. We just have to believe in the Lord that if he has to pay, he will pay.
Maddie says putting her emotions aside and only considering the law was not easy.
I stand by the decision because of the law. If I stand by the decision because of my heart, he would have been guilty.
That exclusive report from ABC, Robin Roberts. Closing statements are underway in the military trial of Army Private Bradley Manning for the disclosure of government information to WikiLeaks. On Thursday, the lead military prosecutor accused Manning of betraying the nation, saying, quote, Manning had the general evil intent. He was not a whistleblower. He was a traitor. Manning's the first ever defendant to face an aiding the enemy charge for leaking government documents to a news source, which could set a major precedent for future cases involving journalists. Defense attorneys are set to make their closing remarks today. The Senate Appropriations Committee has voted to sanction any country that aids NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden. The 30-member panel passed the measure by unanimous consent. It calls on the State Department to work with Congress to level sanctions against any government that helps Snowden evade U.S. extradition. Snowden remains holed up at an airport in Russia, where he's reportedly been granted asylum. The oil giant Halliburton has agreed to plead guilty to destroying evidence following the 2010 oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Under the plea deal, Halliburton will pay the maximum fine and remain on probation for 3 years. Federal prosecutors have unveiled charges against the hedge fund giant SAC Capital Advisors for alleged securities and wire fraud. The indictment accuses SAC of enabling a massive insider trading scheme that reaped hundreds of millions of dollars in profit for the firm and its billionaire owner, Stephen Cohen, over more than a decade. Preet Bharara, the U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, said SAC's scheme is unprecedented in size for a U.S. hedge fund.
When so many people from a single hedge fund have engaged in insider trading, it is not a coincidence. It is instead the predictable product of substantial and pervasive institutional failure. As alleged, SAC trafficked in inside information on a scale without any known precedent in the history of hedge funds. As described in the indictment, the scope of illegal trading was deep and it was wide. It spanned more than a decade in time, involved the securities of at least 20 public companies, extended across multiple sectors of the economy, and benefited SAC to the tune of at least hundreds of millions of dollars.
The charges against SAC mark a rare departure for federal prosecutors in that they chose to avoid a deferred prosecution agreement that allows a firm to avoid indictment if they agree to change their behavior. The banking giant UBS has agreed to pay an $885 million settlement for deceptively selling mortgage-backed securities to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Under the terms of the deal, UBS does not admit to any liability or wrongdoing, and its executives will avoid charges. UBS is among 18 banks pursued by the Federal Housing Finance Agency for dumping the toxic securities that helped cause the nation's financial crisis. UBS previously paid a $1.5 billion fine for its role in the manipulation of LIBOR, the basis for rates on trillions of dollars in transactions across the globe. A federal judge has cleared a lawsuit accusing the Wall Street giant Morgan Stanley of encouraging the targeting of African-American homeowners in Detroit. The plaintiffs in the case include 5 black Detroit residents who say Morgan Stanley helped subprime mortgage lender New Century Mortgage Company issue loans likely to push borrowers into foreclosure. In his ruling, U.S. District Judge Harold Baer tied Detroit's current bankruptcy woes to the actions of major banks, writing, quote, "It is not difficult to conclude that Detroit's current predicament, at least in part, is an outgrowth of the predatory lending at issue here." The North Carolina Senate has passed sweeping restrictions on abortion contained in a motorcycle safety bill. The measures spark mass protests from opponents who say they threaten to shutter clinics. North Carolina Governor Pat McCrory has said he'll sign the bill despite a campaign promise not to approve new restrictions on abortion. A federal judge, meanwhile, has delayed until next year the enforcement of Alabama's new anti-choice law, which threatens to close more than half the state's abortion clinics. The measure forces doctors at the state's 5 clinics to obtain admitting privileges at a local hospital, a step that can be impossible in part because some hospitals oppose abortion. The news comes as abortion rights supporters have launched a nationwide caravan aimed at mobilizing supporters of reproductive freedom. Participants in the Abortion Rights Freedom Ride plan to travel in the coming weeks to Wichita, Kansas, Jackson, Mississippi, and other areas where access to abortion is under attack. Organizer Sansara Taylor spoke at a kickoff rally in New York's Union Square.
We're going to all the states with only 1 clinic left. We're going to North Dakota, where on August 1st they plan to shut down, they have a law that would shut down the only clinic left in North Dakota. We're hoping for an injunction, we're expecting an injunction, but we're going to be there either way because the fact that these laws pass is totally unacceptable. There needs to be a massive fight in this country of people standing up and refusing to tolerate this because women's lives and women's future and ultimately the kind of society we want to live in is at stake.
An Ohio gay couple dealing with a life-threatening illness has won recognition of their marriage after marrying out of state. John Arthur, who's dying of Lou Gehrig's disease, and his husband, James Obergefell, tied the knot in Maryland earlier this month in order to ensure they were legally wed before the end of Arthur's life. A federal judge has ruled Arthur's death certificate must show Obergefell as his surviving spouse, ensuring that the two can be buried next to each other on Arthur's family plot. The ruling could prompt other Ohio same-sex couples married out of state to seek recognition of their unions. Alabama has carried out its first execution in 2 years. Andrew Reed Lackey was killed by lethal injection Thursday night for the 2005 stabbing murder of 80-year-old Charlie Newman. Lackey was put to death despite claims he suffered mental illness. Thousands of people rallied in Tunisia Thursday after a leading opposition figure was shot dead. Mohamed Brahmi, a leftist member of the Tunisian parliament, was killed outside his home. Tunisian unions have called a general strike to protest his murder. A landmark report on Colombia's more than 50-year internal conflict has found nearly 250,000 people have been killed, most of them civilian. The report tackles the military conflict between the Colombian armed forces and leftist guerrillas dating back to 1958, as well as the right-wing paramilitaries that have emerged since the 1980s. Gonzalo Sanchez, head of the Colombian investigative team, unveiled the findings.
Del conjunto de muertes violentas ocurridas en el país.
The total of violent deaths in the country between 1958 and 2012 is at least 220,000, caused by the armed conflict. 80% of these have been unarmed civilians.
Es una guerra que ha enlutado.
It's a war that has left most of the country mourning, but very unevenly. It's a war whose victims are in the vast majority non-combatant civilians. It's a depraved war that has broken all humanitarian rules beyond social and political objectives that multiple gangs could brandish.
According to the report, Colombia's bloodiest period came between 1985 and 2002, when wealthy elites formed paramilitaries to battle rebels and attack civilians. The main paramilitary group, the AUC, the AUC, was responsible for the bulk of nearly 2,000 massacres since 1980, as well as the worst atrocities. The guerrilla group FARC was responsible for the most kidnappings and attacks on infrastructure. An estimated 4.7 million people have been displaced since 1996, and around 1,200 indigenous Indians have been killed over the same period. The paramilitaries have long worked closely with the successive right-wing Colombian governments, who in turn have received billions in U.S. aid. The report was commissioned in 2011 as part of ongoing peace talks with the rebel group FARC. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm